KBTC, a viewer-supported community service of Bates Technical College.
From KBTC Public Television Studios in Tacoma, Washington. Welcome to the Steve on the Street podcast, a closer look behind the headlines as public policy and current affairs impact the real lives of real people.
Hello, and welcome to Steve on the Street podcast, produced by Northwest Now, broadcast on KBTC Public Television. I'm your host of Steve on the Street podcast, reporter and photojournalist Steve Kiggins. Today's episode, we're focusing on the Washington State Legislature and lawmakers' work this session tackling housing affordability. This legislation aims to stabilize rent costs by capping the amount landlords are legally allowed to increase after contracts expire for tenants. As it was passed out of the legislature, House Bill 1217 caps rent increases to 7% plus inflation up to 10%, plus other specific regulations. It's truly historic, and it breaks decades of precedents here in Washington. Next on the podcast, take a listen to our coverage on Northwest Now. Rent control has been illegal in Washington State since the 1980s, but not anymore. Governor Bob Ferguson signed House Bill 1217 into law in the first week of May. This legislation caps rent increases to 7% plus inflation every year. Advocates insist this legislation helps keep vulnerable families from being kicked on the streets, but opponents insist this kind of legislation spooks developers, strangles housing supply, and increases rent.
The rent is too damn high!
Dozens demonstrated on the steps of the legislative building in Olympia back in April, demanding lawmakers combat runaway housing costs in communities across Washington.
We clearly need more renter protections.
Single mom Andrea Bernard joined the rally, and after watching neighbors see double-digit rent increases year after year, she worries she'll soon be priced out of Washington without protection.
Yeah, if I left Seattle, I would need and deserve, just like every other renter, basic protections for some sense of stability.
Organizations like the Washington Low-Income Housing Alliance urge legislators to keep rent increases predictable.
Washington State right now has the highest evictions ever in history. And it's because people can't afford their rent increases. So where do people go? They go to the streets.
With utility costs rising and so much in the future being uncertain, including my state grants, it's hard to feel secure. I still have 3 years left in my degree, and I don't know if I'll be able to afford to stay through the end.
For weeks, lawmakers heard testimony from renters desperate for relief.
Elder tenants have endured 50% rent increases, with many now paying over 70% of their low fixed Social Security income on housing. They come to me in tears saying they fear homelessness.
This will drive investment into other states. This will decrease our ability to build.
They also heard from developers and landlords warning rent control scares off development and does little to impact rent prices in the long term.
We cannot afford to rent if we can't turn a profit.
House Bill 1217 caps rent increases to 7% plus inflation, up to 10% each year, whichever is lower. Rent for manufactured homes caps at 5%. The bill includes some limitations, and caps on rent for apartments and homes sunset in 15 years. Democrats passed the bill without bipartisan support. Republicans warned regulation ultimately hurts renters and pushes development elsewhere.
That the only real predictability that tenants in Washington State are going to have is the assurance that their rent is going to go up 10% a year, year over year.
This is a great bill for Idaho, this is a great bill for Montana, and this is an amazing bill for Arizona.
How do we find the right balance?
University of Washington Real Estate Associate Professor Greg Colburn co-authored Homelessness is a Housing Problem. During a presentation sponsored by the Seattle Public Library Foundation last fall, Colburn shared his research and touched on rent control's controversy.
I'd much rather have a whole bunch of housing built and some subsidies. That to me is an easier path to affordability than regulating the private market, but those things cost money. And so in the absence of resources to do that, then this is where we go.
We've got a crisis on our hands here in Washington State.
Governor Bob Ferguson says House Bill 1217 ensures sudden and large rent increases don't destabilize families. Together with another 9 bills signed into law in early May, Ferguson aims to make building affordable housing easier, even as opponents worry regulation deters investment. What's your concern from developers who claim that this kind of legislation, 1217, just spooks them out of the state?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm confident that this legislation is going to work for everybody in our state. And what we need to have is a balanced approach, right? We need more housing. We need folks to construct that housing. We need folks to rent that housing.
In Seattle, Steve Kiggins, Northwest Now. But finding consensus for lawmakers has been a roller coaster, hearing from a range of folks, from business owners and developers and landlords and tenants, all hopefully to help legislators fully grasp what's at stake. Next on the podcast, take a listen to just a portion of the testimony shared with lawmakers from both sides.
Good afternoon, Senators. Thank you for allowing me to speak today. My name is Roger Jones, and I have 40 years of experience in the mobile home park industry. I currently own 3 parks in eastern Washington, and from my experience, a 5% annual rent increase is more than sufficient to remain profitable in this industry. I'm also a responsible landlord, and with full integrity, I can state that of the 65 tenants who rent from me, the affordable housing we provide is crucial, and without it, a vast majority of these individuals would be homeless. Mobile home parks used to be affordable housing, and with this bill, they can continue to be that. But without this bill, you will leave our most vulnerable citizens unprotected. The scourge of private equity groups racing to acquire parks throughout our state, only to egregiously and repeatedly raise rents, can only be described as unrestrained greed. Investors are exploiting those with limited means who cannot afford to relocate their homes, have nowhere else to go, and cannot even sell their homes in this volatile rental market. They are trapped. Lastly, I receive calls on a weekly basis from all over the country from investment groups wanting to buy any or all of my parks sight unseen. The greed on display is simply astonishing. I express my strongest support for this bill. Please do the right thing, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. I'm a landlord with 2 duplexes in Senator Hansen's district. I became a landlord because I needed retirement income in addition to Social Security. I support this bill because it is fair to me and part of the right thing to do for tenants in Washington. Stable tenants are the key to success for small landlords. I try to keep my rent rises well under 5% to promote stability, and all of my tenants are now stable and long-term. For small landlords like me, keeping rent rises low is smart business, and it's fair to both tenants and landlords. 70% of small residential rentals are owned by small landlords like me. Our needs are very different from those of large landlords. For them, a vacancy is a couple of points of lost revenue. For me, it's a quarter of my rental revenue. Small landlords know that our revenue relies on our tenant stability. Having long-term stable tenants is the only way this works for me, and I think that's the same for other small landlords. In practice, this bill will work for everyone. Thank you for your time.
My name is Sarah Eubank. I live in Bremerton in a senior manufactured home community. I am pro on this bill. Housing costs are a top concern for Washington seniors, and this bill is worth the cost. Enforcement is critical. Seniors are especially concerned with rising rent costs, which are always above the 2.3 to 3% COLA that we see each year. We pay rent on the land that our homes sit on, and we live here because we've been priced out of the housing market. My senior community has had lot rent go up more than 10% some years, which has had a dramatically negative impact on us. Because we live on fixed incomes, that is more than we can absorb. A current YouGov survey shows 81% of voters in Washington across party affiliations support caps on rent increases. Please pass this bill without further amendments or increases to the cap. Thank you so much for your time and support.
Rising rents are destabilizing our families, our school staff, and the state's budget. In just the 23-24 school year, our state reported over 48,000 students experiencing homelessness, which is about 4.2% of our overall student population, and an increase over the prior year. Our homeless service providers contribute part of this to the high rise in local housing prices. In the Seattle area, about 27% of our educators are rent burdened, highlighting the housing affordability crisis among educators. They cannot work in the communities in which they cannot live in the communities they teach. 40% of Washington households rent, and as rents outpace wages, household spending drops, leading to lower sales and B&O tax revenue. The measures that are outlined in House Bill 1217 protects families and helps retain educators in their communities. The indeterminate costs are worth the protections. Please pass the bill.
Hi, good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I'm Sarah Charin from UFCW 3000 with 56,000 members in every district in the state in support of 1217 because rents are too high and grocery workers are being priced out of their own communities. These are the workers who stock our shelves, who bag our groceries and keep our food supply running, but can't afford to live anywhere near where they work. 12% of our members reported having experienced some kind of homelessness and even more severe housing instability. This is a clear signal that immediate action is necessary by this legislature. When weighing the impact of legislation and who will be negatively impacted and who will be positively impacted, we hope that your calculation includes grocery workers' current situation. Rising rents are untenable, and the status quo is not working for working families. This bill offers more than just economic relief. It offers a chance of dignity. Grocery store workers are part of every neighborhood in the state and are asking you to pass 1217. Grocery workers cannot wait.
Good afternoon, Senators. My name is Carl Charette with Avalon Bay, and I'm here to testify on behalf of NAIOP in opposition to HB 1217. Avalon Bay is a national owner and developer of multifamily housing, and I manage our Northwest Development Platform, where we have over 2,500 apartments in the pipeline. Simply put, rent control is bad policy that will push scarce capital and associated tax revenue from new construction to other states in a market where we have already seen where interest rates, construction costs, and tariffs have already caused new starts of housing in Washington to drop to historic lows. This is not politics, this is simple economics. Developers go where they are wanted and sell out of markets where they are not. In light of questions from previous testimony, it is important to highlight the challenging tax environment that developers already face in Washington state. The Nonpartisan Tax Foundation ranks Washington state 45th in the nation for tax competitiveness, only just behind California at 48th and well behind Oregon at 30th and Idaho at 15th. Please trust the decades of research on this topic and reject this bill.
Good afternoon, Chair and members of the committee. Angela Rosman with Natural and Built Environments. Sustainable, affordable housing is our top priority, and unfortunately I'm here as a no on 1217 in its current form. With a $15 billion shortfall, how much housing and state income are we willing to lose? Each unbuilt unit costs the state about $42,000 in lost revenue, nearly $500 million for every 10,000 units. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are watching. If this bill passes as written, they will take their capital elsewhere. Increased risk leads to lower appraisals and higher cash requirements, and projects will be tabled as a result. Capital is portable. If investors don't trust our housing environment, they move to states where the risk makes sense. This isn't a choice that developers make, but the reality of financing. There is a reason why housing is so expensive in California. For this bill to be successful, please tie the rent cap to CPI, extend the new construction exemption to 20 years, and make penalties for mistakes reasonable and correctable. We need reasonable, data-driven decisions. If we truly care about our residents, let's pass housing legislation that does not harm the very people we mean to protect. Thank you.
Thank you, members of the committee, for the opportunity to testify. I'm Emily Thompson with GMD Development, and I urge you to vote no on EHB 1217. This bill will increase the cost burden for the state to provide affordable housing. For-profit developers such as mine and others who control over 30,000 affordable housing units regularly account for more than half of the state's affordable housing production. If we cannot attract investment or justify the increased operational risk posed by this bill and the rent cap, less affordable housing will be built unless the state significantly increases available resources. Further, if overall development drops off, we lose critical resources from permit fees, inclusionary zoning fees, and other revenue that helps fund affordable housing. Over the last 3 years, our affordable properties have $2.3 million in unpaid rent, over 100% increase in operating expenses, and a cumulative operating loss of around $4 million. Negative operations destabilizes tenants. Please let developers and operators be your partner in solving the housing crisis and ensuring stability for tenants rather than passing legislation that makes partnership harder. Thank you, and again, I urge you to vote no on EHB 1217.
Good afternoon. I represent 660 landlords in Yakima, Washington, who are in opposition to 1217. We love providing housing for Washington citizens. We love our tenants, but we cannot afford to rent if we can't turn a profit. We have to be able to pay the bills. We can't be priced out of existence. 1217 will make a terrible existing problem even worse. 1217 will not bring more housing into Washington state. 1217 will not save tenants who are being priced out of existence by inflation. Most of the people testified in favor of this bill are in trouble because cost of living adjustments are not adequate to cover the increase in the cost of living. The same problem exists with landlords. If we get our income capped, we will not be able to continue to provide the service. And 95% of this bill actually is related to landlords. It penalizes them, and there is no mention at all of tenants. 1217 needs to fail. Thank you.
one hand, lawmakers heard from tenants priced out of their communities after seeing double-digit rent increases over the past few years, and that's not just happening in Seattle. On the other hand, business associations, landlord communities, and opponents reject interfering with the private sector, and many opponents point to studies that insist rent control fails to protect low-income families. And many of those opponents insist the most effective way to lower the cost of housing is to increase the supply. Now, before coming to an agreement on the final language for House Bill 1217, multiple amendments were added to the bill that fundamentally altered what was first proposed. Up next on the podcast, listen to an extended interview with Michelle Thomas from the Washington Low-Income Housing Alliance when the original cap of 7% effectively doubled after state senators deliberated.
The Senate brought the bill up for a vote. There was many amendments that had already happened along the way, but it was still a protective bill by the time it got to the Senate floor. And everybody was shocked, absolutely shocked by the terrible amendments that were added. The Senate floor amendments changed the yearly allowable rent increase from a maximum of 7% for residential renters to 10% plus the CPI. Right now, that'd be a rent increase of 13.4%. That would be sanctioned by the state, and it would cause displacement, it would cause instability, and it would increase homelessness. That's wrong. There was another amendment also that exempted everybody who lives in a single-family home. That will have a disproportionate impact on families. Families seek single-family homes because they tend to be the rental options that have more bedrooms, and they have yards for their growing family and their children. It's also more impactful for people who live in rural areas and smaller towns where single-family homes make up a larger percentage of the available rental stock. Why are we going to harm people in smaller towns? Why are we going to harm families with a random amendment that seeks to exempt all of those people who need the same amount of protection as renters who live in multifamily housing? It was a bad amendment, and the Senate needs to agree to remove that and to agree to roll back the bill to allow only a 7% annual rent increase for residential renters.
At this point that it sits at, if we're talking these numbers could go up to 15 to 20% increases,
yes, they
what's
could.
The point of rent stabilization?
There would be no point. There would be no point with the 10% plus CPI. Never. Even 10% is too high. We have a coalition of renters across the state who have said 7% is all we can afford. For a lot of people, 7% is even too high already. The average rent in Washington is $1,833. Multiply a 7% increase on that, and that's still going to be hard for families, but at least provides some stability. But a 10% and then a 10% plus CPI, one, you take out the predictability by adding a CPI standard. You don't know what it's going to be the next year. Two, 10% is just too high. It's just too high. The other problem with the CPI is that the consumer price index is largely influenced by housing costs. So why, when the consumer price index goes up, because of housing costs, would you double down on the harm that renters are already facing by allowing a larger rent increase? It makes no sense, and it only seeks to do harm to renters across the state, whereas the bill was supposed to protect renters across the state.
The tactic at this point is to rally. Here we are.
Yes.
You're taking folks to basically get as close to the legislature as possible to say, hey, this matters to me.
Yes.
You've got just a few number of days. Do you think you've got the power to change it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There was a lot of lawmakers, both in the Senate and in the House, who were really angry. Not just disappointed, but angry with what happened on the Senate floor. And there's a majority of lawmakers who want it fixed. So absolutely, through the conference committee process, there's an opportunity for a better bill that's actually protective and that will actually stabilize people in their homes across the state.
Say you're able to convince lawmakers, you and your cohorts are able to convince lawmakers to come to an agreement that's better for, in your opinion, renters. Does the governor sign the bill?
Yes, the governor has said that they're supportive. We're not concerned about the governor signing the bill at all. The power rests now with the legislature. The legislature have got to get the governor a good bill.
Where do these people go if they can't afford these rent increases? Where do these families go?
That's the problem. Washington State right now has the highest evictions ever in history. And it's because people can't afford their rent increases. So where do people go? They go to the streets. They lose their homes and they experience homelessness. Everybody in our state wants homelessness to decrease. We want solutions to homelessness. Rent stabilization is a solution to homelessness. It stabilizes people in their homes.
Open mic. You want to talk about something you haven't had a chance to already?
There's still an opportunity to fix it. Lawmakers know that this is a problem. Lawmakers have heard from constituents across the state over and over again. Thousands of people have been reaching out to their lawmakers since Friday. There's hundreds of people here today to tell their lawmakers to fix House Bill 1217 and pass a real rent stabilization bill.
Now, ultimately, those higher rental caps were defeated. And again, House Bill 1217 caps rent increases to 7% plus inflation, not to exceed 10%. Now, obviously, rent stabilization and rent control are exceedingly controversial, and the policy is repeatedly being reviewed and studied relentlessly. A University of Washington associate professor of real estate co-authored a book titled Homelessness is a Housing Issue. His name is Greg Colburn, and he spoke publicly about his book during an event sponsored by the Seattle Public Library Foundation in October 2024. And while rent control isn't the focus of his book, he did talk about it during that event. Up next on the podcast, take a listen to select extended remarks from Colburn about rent control and homelessness.
What motivated me to write the book was just an observation that this is so unnecessary. It's totally unnecessary. We have more than enough resources in this country to end this. There are social problems that we're going to be fighting, dealing with long beyond my time on this earth. Unfortunately, we're still going to be dealing with poverty. We're going to be dealing with climate change. We're going to be dealing with racism. I would love for those issues to go away. They're probably not going away. This is one that we could absolutely get rid of in my lifetime. There's no doubt about it. Rent control is one of the more challenging policy topics in housing. And there are obvious benefits, affordability benefits of rent control, which I am pleased about. And there's also plenty of literature that shows when that gets too extreme, we end up having a negative impact on supply. Okay? And so the challenge with rent control and rent regulation, generally speaking, is how do we find the right balance of providing some security to renters such that their rent isn't going to go up 20% or 30% next year, which has been happening, while also making sure that we have an environment that entices developers to build. Is that frustrating? Absolutely. We created a system that is entirely dependent on private developers for our housing. Okay. You might dislike that, and I frankly do as well, but we desperately need this housing. So this is a super, super difficult issue. And so it requires, it requires a lot of nuance. And so generally speaking, I am not a scholar of rent control, and so I try not to say too much because I think it requires a lot of analysis and really a deep understanding. But generally speaking, that's my position on it. I see the benefits of that, and I think there are rent regulations throughout the United States that make a lot of sense, kind of anti-gouging. And then what we have to figure out is when that starts to get a little tighter, what are the impacts and how do we weigh the benefits versus the costs? And that's why this is hard. I'd much rather have a whole bunch of housing built and some subsidies. That to me is an easier path to affordability than regulating the private market, but those things cost money. And so in the absence of resources to do that, then this is where we go.
House Bill 1217 is just one of several bills signed into law by Governor Bob Ferguson aimed to increase housing supply and protect families from debilitating rent increases. Governor Ferguson signed those bills at an event in Seattle in early May, where lawmakers joined supporters celebrating their victory. He was joined by Director of Community Advocacy and Outreach at QLaw Foundation of Washington, Rebecca Gardia, plus State Senator Yasmin Trudeau and State Senator Emily Alvarado. Up next on the podcast, here's state officials describe all 10 bills signed into law and share their remarks during a portion of the press conference immediately after the signing. Here's Washington State Governor Bob Ferguson.
Washingtonians need more housing, lots more housing. We must make it easier, faster, and less expensive to build housing of all kinds. And this group of bills does precisely that, right? It makes it easier. It makes it more streamlined to build more housing, and we need that. So I'm just so thankful for everybody here who's gotten us to this point. I'm also mindful of the fact that we are not all the way there yet, far from it. But hey, I'm a mountain climber. If you want to climb a mountain, right, you don't do it in one step, right? You don't do it in one day. It takes a lot of preparation. It takes a lot of work. There's going up, sometimes you're backtracking, but to get to that mountaintop takes a lot of work. And this is one of those days where you look back on the climb and say, you know what? We made a lot of progress. We made a lot of progress. And I'm confident when folks look back at this legislative session They'll call it, right, the session of affordable housing. I really believe that. Just the range of bills and the work that's done, the investments we're making, it'll be the session of housing. I'm really proud to have been a part of it. House Bill 1106 allows more disabled veterans to qualify for property tax relief. This will help more veterans stay in their homes, especially those who are not able to work because of their disability. The VA assigns a disability rating as a percentage based on the severity of conditions connected to a veteran's military service. This bill cuts the threshold to qualify for property tax relief in half, from a disability rating of 80% or higher all the way down to 40% or higher, opening the door for more veterans to qualify. House Bill 1403. Unclear state rules have created liability issues for middle housing options like condominiums, discouraging their construction. In fact, the rules are so onerous that condominiums are rarely built in Washington. House Bill 1403 cleans up the language in state law to create clear, workable standards. This will encourage construction of this type of housing, which we desperately need. House Bill 1757 enhances one of the tools in Washington's toolbox to build affordable housing. Specifically, this bill requires cities to adopt rules for converting existing buildings into housing in commercial and mixed-use zones by June 30th, 2026. The bill also provides exemptions from the state energy code, accelerating the development of new housing units that we desperately need. And this is Senate Bill 5184. Building parking as part of a housing project is expensive. Each space can add up to $20,000 to the cost of developing a home. That cost more than triples if structured parking is required. Senate Bill 5184 establishes limits on the number of parking spaces cities and counties require for housing projects, ensuring projects do not have excess parking. This lowers the cost of development, making it easier, faster, and cheaper to build new housing that, again, we desperately need. It's good for housing and it's good for business. Residents of manufactured and mobile home parks are vulnerable to rent increases because tenants do not own the land where their house sits. When the land is sold, new ownership often drastically increases rents. Senate Bill 5298 mitigates this by strengthening notification and process requirements when this land is listed for sale. Specifically, this legislation requires sellers to notify both local governments and local housing authorities about the opportunity to compete to purchase these communities. This prioritizes stability and affordability for residents. Washington state tenants have a right to pursue legal action when they are abused by their landlords. Senate Bill 5313 expands the list of provisions that are prohibited in residential rental agreements. These provisions give outsized protections to landlords while limiting tenant options for redress. This bill protects tenants from agreements or contracts that limit their legal recourse in the small print. Next up is Senate Bill 5529. Senate Bill 5529 expands tax incentives to support affordable housing in Washington state. This bill expands the accessory dwelling unit property tax exemption to Pierce County. The exemption is currently only available in King County. The exemption is intended to encourage homeowners to rent accessory dwelling units to low-income households, increasing the overall availability of affordable housing. Expanding this exemption will lower the cost for providing affordable housing in Washington state's second largest county. Okay, this bill is Senate Bill 5611. One of my administration's top priorities is streamlining or eliminating burdensome regulations to make it easier to build housing. Senate Bill 5611 helps address the state's housing shortage by reducing permitting timelines. This will ultimately reduce the cost of development projects, making it easier to build. This bill also enhances communication between permit applicants and the jurisdiction issuing them, making the project development process smoother for everybody. So we're on to our final bill, and one that's obviously especially consequential. This is House Bill 1217, and so we'll do this one a little different. We're going to hear from a couple folks in this one, just given the magnitude of the effort and the work and the implications for it. And so it's really my honor to start with, Senator, you've just been, you've worked hard on this legislation with many other partners. Was that an understatement? And I'll be thanking other legislators, when I have my opportunity to speak. But because I'm introducing you now, Senator Emily Alvarado, has worked extremely hard, and just, one thing I just really respect in life is like people who nose to the grindstone, work hard, they've got a goal, They're focused on it. They're trying to work on behalf of the people. That's their mission. I just really have a ton of respect for that, right? And not everybody's built that way. And this is an example of really being focused and just being really determined, working with everybody here, right? Green shirts, orange shirts, all color, right? All shirts. Working with everybody here, right? Everybody here to make it happen. But again, to my point earlier, you need champions in the legislature, and you were certainly a key one in that regard. So give Senator Alvarado a big round.
State Senator Emily Alvarado.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. They said I could give a couple of remarks, so I will. I just want to start. Thank you so much, Governor Ferguson, for bringing us together for this really important moment. And it's worth starting off by saying that housing is not a luxury. It is a basic human need. And everyone in this state deserves a stable and affordable home. And we all do better when everyone has a stable, affordable home. Children have a chance to succeed in school. Working people have a chance to save and have financial stability. People can retire with dignity. We have improved health outcomes. We can boost our economy, and we can build that state where everyone has a stable home. But we also know that the foundation is rocky right now, and far too many Washingtonians are struggling to keep up with housing costs that keep rising. Rent goes up faster than wages. Seniors see rent go up faster than Social Security. A record number of families in this state are paying more than half of their income on rent. That's not okay. And we've seen that there are excessive rent increases, 10, 20, 30%, that are having devastating impacts across our state. But today, we put common sense guardrails on our rental housing market so that hardworking families and older adults don't get unchecked excessive rent increases. This law is a good beginning. It's long overdue, and it's urgently needed. 40% of the people in the state of Washington are renters or manufactured homeowners, and before today, they had no protections over how high the rent can go, leading to pain and to devastating destabilization of families and communities. And meanwhile, at the federal level, it's worth noting that the president has proposed a budget that seeks to strip $40 billion out of essential housing programs, that would cut rental assistance, that would take away state and local resources that we can use to address homelessness. That's not okay. And we have critics here who tell us not to intervene in the private market. Well, I believe that we can't stand by and wait while families and seniors struggle to keep up with housing costs. We have to take action, and today we're taking action in a time of economic instability and uncertainty. Today, we can protect hardworking people. We can protect seniors against the worst kind of rent gouging that far too many people have experienced. I have to say we're only here today because of the tremendous persistence and advocacy from regular people in every corner of the state of Washington who banded together, said the status quo isn't working, enough is enough. We have renters and manufactured homeowners who came from Bellingham and Vancouver, from Kenmore and Seattle, from Sequim, to say that we have to stop these devastating rent increases. We had workers and unions, teachers and healthcare providers, faith leaders, local government officials, small business owners, and landlords too, who know that this policy is a good start to rein in housing costs, prevent homelessness, and make communities more stable. And I want to thank incredible advocates, including Michelle Thomas from the Washington. To thank Representative Nicole Macri, who was the first sponsor of an anti-rent gouging bill in 2018. She's always ahead of the curve, and she is the true champion for working people and for renters in the state of Washington. To Senator Trudeau, who sponsored this in the Senate and who has been an incredible partner to work with to bring this across the finish line, to the chairs of our housing committees in the legislature, Representative Strom Peterson and Senator Jessica Bateman. Both of them recognize that to have a housing market that functions, we have to also think about people and having people be stable. Now, there is no single housing policy that will fix our housing crisis. No single policy. But we need this comprehensive approach, and I believe we can do all the pieces. We need so many more homes in this state, 1 million more homes, and we have to reform zoning and permitting and land use to make it easier to build homes of all types in all communities. We need significant public investment so we can increase the supply of truly affordable homes for folks with disabilities and for seniors on a fixed income, for working families who are locked out of home ownership. We also need tenant protections, and we need protections for homeowners to keep people out of foreclosure. We can do all things. We can do it together. I am grateful so much for all of my legislative colleagues who are fighting for short-term and long-term solutions to rein in housing costs. And I'm deeply grateful to the governor for your support of a comprehensive solution. Today, I'm proud that we can stop unfair price gouging so that renters and manufactured homeowners have basic consumer protections and a little bit more peace of mind. And I look forward to working with all of you to make sure Washington is a place where everyone has a stable, affordable home. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to bring up, we talked about the advocates who made this happen, an incredible advocate, and thank you for sharing your story, Rebecca Gardea.
Rebecca Gardea from Q Law Foundation.
Yeah, I don't know how to follow that. I'm going to be using my notes. So I'm Rebecca Gardea. I use she and her pronouns. I work with Q Law Foundation of Washington. We are a legal organization who provides free legal support to folks in the queer community. We hear from our community members through our legal consultations all the time about the things that they are navigating as renters here in this state, but I'm also here today as a renter myself here in Seattle. First, I want to say a huge, huge thank you to our bill sponsors and our lawmakers who worked so hard and fought for the strongest version of this bill from start to finish this session. Your leadership was so inspiring to witness, and you kept us going in moments that felt so challenging. This bill is a really meaningful step, right? But it is the first step towards stability for renters across the state of Washington. It's not the version that so many of us here in the room fought so hard for, right? But it is a start, an important start that acknowledges the rental crisis that so many of us are navigating. At the same time, it's important to acknowledge that 10% and 7% plus CPI is still too high for so many folks who are navigating this crisis here in this state. But today, it's an important moment to stop and celebrate this first start, right? To keep us going because we have work ahead of us. So today we celebrate. This is progress, meaningful progress that is meaningful to the people here in the state. And I want to acknowledge all of the hard work that so many community members put into this, to Low Income Housing Alliance, to the nonprofits in our community who are advocating round the clock for our community members, and the community members themselves who showed up on Advocacy Day, and they showed up on the Capitol steps again to talk to lawmakers and tell their stories. That is the hardest part about showing up sometimes, is sharing your own personal stories of navigating hardship and hoping that the people with power can hear you. So I just want to thank everyone who was a part of this movement. We have work ahead of us, but today we celebrate. This is a huge moment. So thank you to our lawmakers and
Please join me in thanking Rebecca for being here in her hard work. And Senator Alvarado already called out, two of her colleagues, Nicole Macri and Yasmin Trudeau, but I don't think we can thank them enough. Another round of applause for the two of them. Another big round of applause for Senator Alvarado. And I'll be brief because really, Senator, I think you and Rebecca covered most of what I was going to say, but I will just add, I think both of you touched on, and I think especially you, Senator, touched on sort of the voices of the people in this process. And I think that is true on any major legislation, but I do believe that to be particularly true here. I'll just say from my personal experience, the number of times I would have someone come up to me and, for example, say, hey, I'm a renter, I work in downtown Seattle, I clean buildings in downtown Seattle. I used to live relatively close to the city, then I moved a little further away, and a little further away, and a little further away, as the rent went up each time. Some version of that story, Senator, right? I heard many, many times, over the course of traveling across the state. And I really do believe this, that, and this is an example of that for Washingtonians who may be watching this or listening to this, is that, your voice matters in the legislative process. It does. And it doesn't have to be necessarily before a committee. It's speaking to your local elected official in the grocery store, right? Or when you run into them on the campaign trail, or whatever your connection is at the softball game. You get the idea. Those conversations, I'm just telling you, they really do make a difference. And I think today really does epitomize having all those voices from so many organizations and individuals and, of course, legislative leaders who help make this possible.
Governor, what do you say to local elected officials who feel like Olympia is telling them how to operate with their unfunded mandates?
Sorry, repeat that one more time.
What do you say to local elected officials who are upset that Olympia is telling them how to do housing?
Well, what I would say is, I'll speak as a former local elected official, right? That local elected officials need to work in partnership with the state and vice versa. There are many conversations, I can assure you, and others may want to speak to that, but that's part of our process. And so what I will say, and I'll let others if they want to add to this, but what I'll just say, speaking for myself, is, if you have a crisis, you need to act like there's a crisis. When it comes to affordable housing, we've got a crisis on our hands here in Washington State. We're not the only state grappling with this. I hear from other governors about this as well. But doing things business as usual is not going to work. And I appreciate, Senator Alvarado, what you had to say about it takes multiple aspects, multiple ways that this challenge to address it. So we're happy to work with local legislators. We've done that in the past. We'll do that in the future. And if anyone else wants to add to that, by all means. Yasmin. Yes.
State Senator Yasmin Trudeau.
I think one of the things that's really important to note is that we had a lot of local elected officials that supported this legislation and actually came out and testified and talked about why a statewide solution was so significant. I can tell you, as representing the 27th, I also represent, the honor of representing Tacoma. Tacoma has done a lot of forward thinking on housing policy. We haven't always had the same reciprocation in other areas of Pierce County. And so where it is that, we end up having disproportionate effects in one city as a result of other cities, needing to address their own housing crisis, I think it's important that we address it statewide. And we heard from landlords and housing providers that uniformity of a statewide solution was actually something that they really appreciated and wanted. So there was predictability no matter where they build in the state of Washington.
Other questions?
Governor, would
yes.
you?
Sorry. I'll come back. Sorry. Go ahead.
What's your concern from developers who claim that this kind of legislation, 1217, just spooks them out of the state?
Yeah, look, I'm confident that this legislation is going to work for everybody in our state. And what we need to have is a balanced approach, right? We need more housing. We need folks to construct that housing. We need folks to rent that housing. But we also need, and you heard this pretty compelling from not just today, but throughout a lengthy process of public conversation about this legislation, that too many folks are getting priced out, and we can't have that, right? That's not an option. And so look, I'm not suggesting it is easy to draw those lines from my perspective. That's not easy. I know there's a lot of discussion in the state legislature on where the right line is. But from my perspective, I think the legislature did a really good job of trying to hear all those concerns and balance those with the very obvious concern and what you heard today and what you see from the folks who are here today of the need for folks who deserve to have stable housing and not be continually priced out of their residence. Anyone else want to add on that?
State Senator Emily Alvarado.
I would just add that this is really an anti-gouging policy that prevents and prohibits some of the most excessive kinds of rent increases. 7 plus CPI with a max of 10. So currently, that's a 10% limit on rent increases. And I think what we hear is that this is set at a way where landlords can continue to raise the rent, make a fair return, invest in the property, and even make a profit while balancing that interest as a property holder with the interest of people having basic stability in their rent. So it's a balanced proposal. It allows for new construction to continue. We welcome new construction in the state of Washington and have engaged in a lot of other policy making to help empower the building of more homes. But this is a balance that'll help protect tenants too.
Housing affordability in Washington is out of reach for many. A typical home across the state is worth about $600,000. Washington is the fourth least affordable state for housing across the U.S. Housing prices don't just impact buyers alone, they also drive rental costs. On one hand, we see renters clamoring for protection and relief. On the other, investors and business owners and others insist rent control doesn't work. Instead, they insist increasing the supply is the key to lowering prices. And perhaps all of those may be true. Yet again and again, by the time we see rental costs skyrocket, we don't see a market capable of responding quickly enough to absorb those increases, and results in families being priced out of homeownership and renters unable to keep up, being forced out of their communities, sometimes forced into homelessness. So now Washington is trying its hand at rent stabilization, and we'll just have to wait and see the impact the policy has on our communities. And finally, during debate inside the legislative building before senators cast their vote on House Bill 1217, Republican Senator Keith Wagner from the 39th Legislative District said, if the data reveals lawmakers made the wrong choice with rent stabilization, he hoped they could find the courage to reverse course. So, thanks again to Andrea Bernard for sharing your voice on the broadcast. And thanks to Michelle Thomas from the Washington Low Income Housing Alliance for sharing your voice on the broadcast and the podcast. And of course, thank you. You could be anywhere. You could be doing who knows what, but here you are with me, spending the effort and the time to join me on Steve on the Street podcast. Your continued support just by listening, I'm forever grateful you choose to be here with me. Thank you. Northwest Now covers the issues and stories, the people and places that reflect and define who we are and where we call home. Join our broadcast each week, Fridays at 7:30 p.m. on KBTC Public Television. Once more, I'm reporter and photojournalist Steve Kickens, host of Steve on the Street podcast. Until next time, cheers.